Hi, welcome everybody. SUSE QE Tools Workshop, first session of this year 2023. Last year, we already discussed and learned from interviewing Chris how the Scrum Master works in our team of SUSE QE Tools. And today we want to follow up that and learn about the developer role. For that, Marius opted to share a bit of his usual day. So, Marius, would you like to start showing something, walking through? Should we interview
Um,
with you?
I would actually go through a few things first, and maybe then I can show some hands-on
Yeah, perfect. Do
stuff.
that.
Yeah. So um, first, that's our wiki where we describe what we actually expect from team members, and of course, this kind of list is also basically what I'm doing. Like, uh, yeah, I mean, we have all these categories here. I'm not going through them now specifically, but for instance, for my day, code makes, of course, quite a big share. And you can see a lot of repositories are involved. That's also where I have some special helper to actually bring all Git repositories up to date um, in one command, basically just a shell script which loops through my repositories and does some Git commands to bring them up to date. Um, Yeah, we also see build here. Of course, for a Perl project, it's not very important, but I also have some helper to help with the C++ bits in OS AutoInst to trigger the build automatically as part of updating the Git repository. So basically everything is one command. Um, Yeah, test is likely the most important one for us and also for developing. We often try to write tests first, so that's test-driven development. And I think the most important aspect here is to not only write tests first, but also to make minimal changes, very small changes, and then directly test them. So you run your test suite a lot, basically. After every small bit you can change. And hopefully also even before to check whether tests actually run in your environment. Um, yeah, release is maybe something I'm not that much concerned with, but of course, we also frequently do things on OBS or directly using the OC command. Um, yeah, the deployment is maybe more important. That's for me kind of part of the alert handling, because if the deployment fails, it's basically in my workflow the same as if an alert is failing. So more to that later. Um, yeah, operate. Well, my job is really often also um, to just log in to some machines via SSH or IPMI and see what I can do to recover something that's broken. Yeah, so that makes also quite a share of the time. And you can also see we mentioned some salt repositories here. So at this point, also adjusting salt recipes is quite important. Also for O3, we do everything manually. I heard somebody in the chat. Do you have a question? No, okay. Yeah, then we have monitor. Yeah, so that's basically about the alert handling. And for me, this is mainly looking at my inbox to see whether there are new mails. I use filtering or automatically sorting mails into folders so I can also specifically see all alert related mails. Of course, if you have tons of alert mails for some reason, then it maybe makes more sense to check on Grafana itself what alerts are still there, because many alerts can sometimes be triggered for the same reason. Yeah, we also have be responsive on chats. So of course, I always have certain chat tools open, not only Slack, but also Element for our Matrix channel. I even still have um, as some kind of fallback IRC open, but likely I wouldn't set it up anymore today. Yeah, so that's this list. Maybe you've seen it before. I don't think I have to share the link to this wiki anymore at this point. Yeah, one thing, I and many people in the tools team also have their own helpers, or I call it helpers. Well, Oliver, for instance, has its scripts repository. And I personally also use some of his scripts, but if you really want to see how I have set up my machine in detail, then this is basically just the documentation of my setup. Um, and it actually has a lengthy README file where I also write down some notes I find useful, like, yeah, like for instance here, testing AMQP. And this stuff is not written so it's very user friendly. It's really just my notes, but it's at least on GitHub and somebody else could make use of it. Yeah, so that's basically my setup. I'm using Tumbleweed, but other team members are also using Leap. But if you actually want to use the helpers, I think you should better stick with Tumbleweed because it's not really tested somewhere else. We also actually have under the official organization a scripts repository. So sometimes I'm using scripts directly from here. These are more for automated things like the OpenQA hook script, but you can also sometimes use these scripts standalone. For instance, to check whether there are still issues with a certain label, jobs which have been labeled with a certain issue, I mean. Some other members in the team are also sharing their knowledge or how they set up something. For instance, Chris has its blog, which has the OpenQA tag, and yeah, you can see things like writing OpenQA tests in Python or running standalone tests with ISO2 video. So that's also maybe interesting if you want to know how we develop. Of course, I could go on, like sometimes I'm using also the OpenQA Mon tool. Yeah, so it's really more than just my helpers. For me, I also check what other people are using and partially use their tools as well. Of course, there is the documentation. So if you want to set things up as a developer, I still recommend the official documentation. I think development, right here, custom installation. The only problem about this is that it's more tailored for actually for you test writers. But if you really want to develop things, you would actually not follow it that closely. At least you likely wouldn't install the packaged version. Well, you maybe want to just to have, uh, but for development itself, you would likely just clone Git repositories. So that's just a little bit of a catch. If you started with the packaged version, there's nothing wrong with it, but you will likely set up all things then again in addition for development, right? Because you don't want to edit in files that are belonging to packages, basically. So my preferred setup is I have everything belonging to OpenQA in one directory where everything is cloned and owned by my regular user, which is also how I start services. But I'm aware that other people prefer to do it differently. But I personally think it's the easiest to just have all files owned by your regular user and also edit everything using your regular user. That especially makes it easy if you prefer to use a graphical editor.
But
Or
that's actually also what we have described in documentation, just in the section development setup. So
yes,
not there.
that's
We have more or less at the end. Yeah, that one. So that is part of the document OpenQA developer guide. So to be clear, when we say OpenQA developer guide, we mean not when you want to use OpenQA and actually develop OpenQA tests or like tests using OpenQA, but rather want to work on OpenQA itself, which is our main or our one of our daily jobs or one of Mario's daily.
yes, so right, we have the development setup guide. I also highly recommend it for the conducting tests session. Yeah,
Yeah.
I just mentioned.
Marius, Pavel raised his hand.
Okay. Yes, you can ask.
I sorry to interrupt. This is actually quite interesting because, well, I did not do much of OpenQA development yet. I mainly just work on e-tests, but uh, yeah, I think that this is definitely worth checking because so far when I wanted to change something in OpenQA or specifically OS Autoinst, I just well modified the files on my system and then kind of prepared a pull request on the side.
Yeah,
And then after zipper update, it got reversed. So yeah.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah, that's sometimes a good thing or sometimes a bad thing. I mean, if it's reverted, you are back to um, well, the normal
To a
state.
sane
But
state. So
Yes.
it's that's a good thing. But of course, you have the possibility with us using mostly scripting languages, so you can do that. And this is I mean, this is something that we use sometimes, seldomly, rarely, but we still do. For example, when we want to test something out in let's say in a more specific, exotic setup, maybe something that we only have on individual machines, maybe something related to special backends, which are not possible to completely simulate within unit tests. Then We still want to have some tests which are covering it with mocking and it's simulating, but in the end, it also needs to be tested on those backends. And then it can make sense to temporarily make those changes in, let's say, in the production code.
Yeah. But let me continue here. Um, so that so where was I? Basically, I wanted to say some, I think, most important aspects for me, how the development setup should work. And I already covered everything is owned by my regular user and also built and started by my regular user. So, and the second point is important because if you just use sudo for some reason, then things are obviously owned by root. If you then not use it consistently this way and switch back to your normal user, you will have a hard time because then it maybe tries to override files that belong to root. So you should really not use sudo in the
Yeah,
middle or
sudo is kind
something
of
else.
contagious. If you start with that, eventually you will need to use it for everything, and
Yeah,
it's not the right approach.
by the way, I'm mentioning these things also were obvious because I often get asked by people or find a setup that's a bit messed. So I'm just saying.
Yeah, good that you mentioned
Um,
that. There was a hand raised by
yes.
Phoenix.
Thank you. Maybe you will talk about this later, but if you say that everything is owned by a regular user, how do you do the asset handling, which in general
Yeah,
is
I
important?
will say that later.
Thank you.
I will basically say the key to all of this just in a moment. Um, but okay, let's still continue with the next point. That also means I build OS auto inst binaries manually. I think it's not such a great idea to say, oh, I only develop OpenQA, so let's just use the packaged OS auto inst. I still just want everything from Git or nothing from Git, just to reduce my own confusion about things. Um, so all dependencies are preferably installed via zipper. I think that's under Tumbleweed very much possible. You don't have to rely on cpan much. Maybe if you want to try out an older version of something. Also, sometimes I just clone that then from GitHub, adjust the Perl path and be done with it. Because that actually allows me also to do everything I want, like having custom changes. Yeah, no containers use. That's just because I feel I don't need it on OpenSUSE. Of course, sometimes I use Docker when I, let's say, need to try something on Leap, but I'm on Tumbleweed right now. But for the primary setup and use cases, I would say it's not required. But of course, other people in the team use containers more aggressively. For instance, they use Toolbox. Yeah, I think I already talked about sudo and root. Sometimes it's still required for some cases. In this documentation, it's therefore then always explicitly mentioned. So what's the key to this? It's basically export OpenQA base build. That's the most important variable. That's basically specifying the directory everything lives under. So normally you have the prefix var lib openqa, and for this setup you change it to hdd openqa devil. In my case, you can change it to every place you want, but something you have read and write access. And something that's big enough. That's actually important because yeah, we mentioned assets before. They will live there and they might be big. So that's why it's here under HDD and not SSD. And I must say the HDD is good enough for this. Yeah, then there's a lot of other stuff, but that's not really important right now. The key is really the OpenQA based variable. And I think these days it's actually also honored by OpenQA Clone Shop, but if not, you can always specify also the prefix in OpenQA Clone Shop, so it would clone your assets there and not under valid OpenQA. So also no sudo required for OpenQA Clone Shop. Of course, I also create a different database. So still, of course, the same Postgres service itself, but a different database for my development setup than for the package setup, just to keep everything really distinct.
Yeah, just to add something there. So all of those steps are not required depending on the individual tasks. So this is what you do depending on all the different tasks, and really to have a complete and full setup covering all the aspects, including manually trying out something in a near production database, right? But
right,
not the real production. So when we mentioned the OpenCode documentation, where we can just say make test. That one is also using databases. It's like creating databases on the fly for the individual tests as needed. But it's like those databases are tiny. Okay, so they are quick to execute, and they are quick to spawn and stop again. But of course, they can't cover all aspects. In particular, when you're working on issues like performance scalability issues, then it's also relevant to say to have something a bit more bigger, realistic, but something that we cannot necessarily include in the automated tests, right?
Yeah, so the test database, and with that I mean the database used by unit tests of OpenQA, which Oliver also mentioned, is described in the official documentation. I also have some helpers there, for instance, to not having to type stuff like this all the time, but I really recommend using the documentation because it gives you the bits under the hood. And you can also still use make targets, which I also sometimes use. The problem with make targets is, I think they have some problems about handling interrupts, like you press Control C on your keyboard correctly. And sometimes you just want to pass a specific argument to proof or something. So yeah, then it's not 100%
Then this longer
useful
command
perhaps.
works on top with just let's say a bit more low level, but you can always start with the make. It will give you a good starting point.
Yes. So the concrete commands I use really differ depending on the use case. Sometimes you really have to add an argument to proof, sometimes not. Yeah, sometimes you really need to do something special to provoke an error, or yeah. So that's why we also have documented not only the high level make targets, but also low level things. Yeah, so that's, I think, the most important part of the development setup. Of course, that's not everything. I mean, that session was basically how do I do my day, and it's not all about coding. but I think the other aspects aren't very interesting, or at least not so much. I mean, using GitHub here to review is very important actually, because I do it a lot, but I think there are no secrets to share here. And it's also not very specific to OpenQA, but of course I basically go through this list. It's also nice that you can mark something as unread again if you if you notice, okay, that's now a bit too much right now. So you won't forget to look into it again. That's maybe something interesting. I don't use the emails for GitHub because that's too much and this list is much nicer. I also, of course, do the same on our internal GitLab. And I would say that's mainly the most important parts.
Okay.
Yeah, did I forget something? I think
We will see
not.
about that. I have one question in mind, but first let me ask the audience. So, do you guys have any question to Mario? Something about, yeah, stuff that he works on, or stuff that's mentioned or did not mention? Yanis?
One question about the scripts that from your repo. Are they specific to particular setup?
Yes, they are basically my setup, and in the team we have different preferences. Like somebody uses Toolbox instead of this no containers. I use bullet point. Some people use ZPen instead of zipper. And I also encounter that you guys are doing things different. For instance, like you just mentioned, editing files on the file system, where the files are actually owned by the package. And this is also specific to Tumbleweed, I suppose. At least the bootstrapping script, which would set up repositories, is most likely not going to work anywhere else. But it's not so easy to make it work everywhere else, because I also need to test it. Oh, and by the way, that's maybe also why that isn't upstream. It's not really tested very often. It's really a documentation of what I did at some point. Maybe even currently under Tumbleweed, the setup script won't work. For me, not a big deal. I would just fix it when I need it again. But just keep it in mind.
Yeah,
so
but we
this
already
is
took over some ideas from that repository in
Yes,
our
I often try
Eric.
to upstream documentation you find here. So that's definitely something. And stuff that remains here is really a bit specific.
But still potentially usable by others. So, I really like the approach that you have such an organized way to keep your own notes and publish them so that others could try it out and have a hint which helps you. Right?
Yes, so I really try to keep it organized and also public. If it's public, you are automatically forced to have it structured a bit nicely, and that's actually also beneficial for yourself in the future.
That's a very cool benefit of public open source.
But one thing I, for instance, regularly do, just to say, give you some hands-on stuff. Of course. that SSH agent, for instance, is spawned using some systemd unit, but I still need to add my passphrase. And that's that script I was talking about, which updates repositories. Like here, it gives you everything. Oh, and here you can see in my workflow, I'm very often checking stuff out from you if you create a pull request and really test it locally. So you see many names here you might know. Yeah, just because I want their things also locally. And that's now at OS AutoInst, so it really goes through all repositories. And yeah, it will also build OS AutoInst in the process. It will also go over the test distribution and needles. Has somebody raised his hand?
Yeah, that is hand raised from Phoenix.
Yeah.
Just because before we advance there, Marius, there is this nice thing about running a Arch64 test locally on your x86 machine. Perhaps because this is so useful, perhaps it is worth to talk about this for 1 or 2 minutes. In the same way, let me close.
You really find that useful?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, because I must say I did it and didn't find it very useful because of that. When your fan speed increases, it works, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, I don't want my fan speed to increase, but that's really just a nice way of saying it's ridiculously slow. um, so I didn't find it very useful because of the speed. And of course, I also have access to our production AR64 workers and can borrow them if I need. So that's also why it's still less useful to me. But yeah, is there any particular question about it?
No, but just to highlight, you can run Arch64 workers on your own development machine by the snippet that's you provided on the repository in there, and this is sometimes really useful if you just need access to Arch64 workers for doing some development or testing on your own instance. Cannot apply, especially the performance issues, but still, I think this is very useful.
Yeah, it definitely there is a way to also cover that. So, you don't need to say I need a 10K euro AH64 server to develop a certain feature. That is not a blocker. And even if the simulated way doesn't work, I mean, Marius also mentioned one point that you borrow something from production, which we also offer to you. Right? So if you work on a feature and you say I need, I don't know, some 90 instance, go ahead. We can make that happen. Janis, you still had your hand raised. Have another follow-up question?
I had something, but not. Let's continue.
Okay, then Pavel next.
Yeah, I would have a theoretical opposite question. What if I have ARM64 machine? Can I run OpenQA and OpenQA worker natively on it? I can, right?
Yes,
Yes.
you can. I think we have actually one member in the team who does it this way. I think it's Sebastian, who has a MacBook, and I think he runs a Tumbleweed VM.
Okay.
Of course, not emulated, basically, yeah, hardware virtualization. And within that VM, he therefore has basically an AR64 Tumbleweed, and he runs then tests for that architecture. I think that works. Of course, then you have the opposite problem if you want to run an x86 test.
Exactly.
Yeah,
but
but
Then maybe the native architecture in a month or a year for some people may become ARM, and they may time to time needs to virtualize Intel.
yes,
exactly, and that's possible. Uh, we
that
build
could
we build the packages and we test the packages on. Well, we tested the most on x86 64. This is just because it's also most common in the in the offer for the CI infrastructure. But there's no problem to do that on AH64 as well. So with a bit more limited capacity, which we have there, including OBS, we do still build it for AH64. We also build and test it on PowerPC and yeah, build OpenQA on PowerPC, but that has some further limitations. So like the third
Yeah.
priority.
yeah. By the way, just because we are at it, um, I think I was also the one to write this section. Um, it's maybe not so super important for you, but that's what I sometimes do. It's about these special backends where you need a specially prepared host, and you can also take that host from production easily and yeah, run your own worker with your own worker code and OS Auto-ins code using that production host. Yeah, we also have some other sections here which are interesting and which are similar to my helpers, maybe not very detailed, but contain useful commands. Right, that is, for instance, also some painful thing I had to do recently using iPXE to set up O3 workers. Yeah, so basically my workflow and things I do is really very much uh, either in that helpers repo or already upstream in the wiki. Yeah, by the way, that's not the wiki I've shown before. Before I've shown this one in the QA folder, and that's, well, project, and that's basically in the OpenQA project. So that in the nested project contains more these technical informations you want, such as I've shown before, like accessing VO3 infrastructure. Every time when somebody tells me I need O3 access, I actually literally just copy and paste that. Yeah, but I also saw there was another question in the chat, so maybe you can ask. Or was it just some old raised hand?
Yeah, I think this was from Phoenix, referencing to the cross architecture.
Right, to that section.
So let me have a question, if I may. What's your you mentioned the tasks that you regularly do, and you also mentioned what you don't need to um, care about that much or not at all. Maybe you could add what you don't need to care about anymore. Maybe because we worked on that, improving information or something. So something that you needed to do in the past, but now don't have to do anymore because you can trust in better ways.
I must say we improved the monitoring aspects a lot. However, in the past, my job wasn't also so much concerned with it, but likely that would have been more annoying in the past. So the monitoring is quite nice. You just have to check for mails. Of course, it's on the other side not about or not covering O3. So
We also have monitoring for O3.
yeah, not so much, but yeah, we also have it to some degree. But for instance, yesterday I just found out by accident that OpenQA Worker 4 isn't running anymore. Actually, maybe there was a notification about it, but
Nah, I
that
think
was
you were just quicker than the monitoring.
yeah, likely.
It would have told us this warning the latest. Okay, good. This brings me to the next question, but first, Yanis, you can have another chance.
Yeah, okay. First of all, let's go back to OpenQA helper, right? One thing for me, it sounds like more, for me, OpenQA helper is more like OpenQA development bootstrap, right?
Mm-hmm.
To some degree, the bootstrapping is of course not really used by me except the one time I set it up. It's actually more about stuff like the OpenQA base there and other things you can do to tweak the setup. So I would say the bootstrapping is likely the worst part of this whole repository because that part isn't really well tested. And maybe because you don't want to run random stuff on your system, you likely don't want to execute it and just have a look at it and see what it would do and see what you find useful from that script. It even has comments.
And my main question is like, um, with this, I'm gonna use again bootstrapping, but you start a single machine to run one job. How do you go with a multi-machine? You have to go all the way, you know,
Okay,
alone.
how do I do multi-machine? Well, you can simply um, run multiple workers in parallel. The setup allows it, but also the package setup allows it. And I think that's not really so much specific to the development itself. I mean, regardless how you set it up, you can always have multiple workers. Of course, they would mainly run on the same host. Of course, if I want to test the tab setup and actually want to test also the GUI tunnels, then I usually do it in production because then usually we want this kind of setup in production and I need to verify whether it works there anyways. Um, for the GUI tunnels, I also make sure that jobs are really running on the different hosts by specifying the worker class. And for that, I use the clone job command and I use the export command flag or something like that, which only gives you a command line which you can tweak later to set the variables of the individual jobs it would clone. So you can say this job in the cluster gets the worker class OpenQA worker 19, the other job gets the worker class OpenQA worker 1. And that way, for instance, I'm testing the tab and also GUI setup in production by cloning these then in production.
Wait,
By the way,
sorry. How do you test development feature of OpenQA in production?
um, Okay, so the multi-machine setup for me is mainly not really about OpenQA itself, but that the tab setup and grid tunnels are set up correctly. But if I wanted to run a development version of OpenQA in production, I would either deploy it using packages, or I would simply apply a patch using the patch command. That's actually not very difficult if you know how patch is used. I, of course, try to avoid that.
I see. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, by the way, you mentioned multi-machine. This document here also contains how you can set up multiple web UIs at the same time on the same host. So that's something I sometimes tested locally to see how the worker behaves if it needs to serve different web UIs at the same time. Yeah. By the way, if I want to test the development aspects of the multi-machine setup, then that's mainly dependency handling. So that's actually nothing you really need a functioning multi-machine setup in the sense of having tab devices and grid tunnels.
Yeah,
right?
so it's the first step. It's just multiple worker instances that you show.
Right, it's just having multiple worker instances and jobs scheduled in the way they should be scheduled. Whether those jobs actually do multi-machine stuff or not is actually not important. You just want to see that jobs run in parallel than they should, or I don't know, directly chained jobs run that way when they should. So for this, you really don't need to do much. And you actually can also rely a lot on the test suite. You need to write tests anyways. So it makes actually sense to start this way, and also mainly focus on the test suite. Also, of course, with these things, more manual tests, which usually are then more integration or even tests of the full OpenQA system rather than just unit tests, are also very helpful. Yeah, so that hopefully covers that. The most tricky parts of the multi-machine setup is the dependency handling. That's really mainly tested using the test suite and by running tests, which are actually not multi-machine tests at all.
Okay, cool. Further questions or notes? Then let me have another question. How much of your rough estimate, Marius, how much of your time do you spend on individual areas of work, like coding on your own, code review, supporting people in chat, planning and designing together with us within the team?
It really depends on what I currently have on my plate. So some days are really about coding if I picked up an issue that involves it. Like yesterday, I couldn't spend any time on coding, maybe a little time on review on the site. And then there were also some planning meetings. So yeah, that wasn't a day for coding, but sometimes if it's more quiet and you have an according ticket, it's all about coding. it's sometimes a bit difficult if you have a day like yesterday to find time for coding, not because you couldn't spare half an hour, but because for me it's always not that motivating to say, okay, at the end of the day, the last half hour, I do some coding, because usually it's I try to stay focused a little bit
Right.
longer. Let's phrase it this way. So
Understandable.
it's actually hard to estimate because it really differs a lot. And I must say, these days, operation and monitoring and so on takes a little bit more time than it did before.
Yep.
And bigger features like the development mode aren't really developed itself anymore a lot, only smaller features. Or sometimes if people ask me something and I can quickly implement some improvement, I do that. So it's more about smaller improvements.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to
Cool.
estimate or to give a ratio at this point
Right.
because it's really distributed not very equally.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Then I would like to give the final question before we come. How do you feel about, well, you gave a really nice example from your point of view. And of course, some things are shared by others and do the same, and some you do differently. That's fine. But how do you judge about the truck factor in general? How much of the work, if you would be away for 2 months, how would others do the work or do it differently?
Well, thanks to sickness and then the holiday break, which was also a little bit longer for me than for others, um, I would say I was actually quite recently away, and I must say development on OpenQA maybe felt a little bit low. So that's also because people tend to do some more important operational stuff maybe and haven't had the time to really start with more development. Also, it's also a bit simply our backlog. I'm not sure how features like the dependency handling would be developed. I mean, that means you really need to dive into the code a lot, or also features that involve the communication between multiple components. Um, those are basically the worst because you really need to understand many places and the interactions between them, take care of race conditions and so on. You cannot just blindly write some code hoping it won't be a problem if an exception is thrown or something like that. So these kind of more difficult things, I don't know. We have Sebastian in our team. He's very good at just making sense of our code because he's so familiar with the tooling. So he, even though he isn't developing so much regularly, often has some very great insights. And I think he would be able to move on. But I think most people would. For instance, when I started, it was also that I had very less knowledge of Perl and all the frameworks and stuff, and I just learned it. and I did learning by doing. I also do it this way at this point. I don't just learn stuff for the sake of learning, and yeah, I just read the documentation as far as needed. And I think everybody can just take the time to dive into OpenQA development. You just shouldn't hesitate to actually look in the documentation at all. I mean, when I say I look at the documentation as far as needed, it means I look at the documentation at all. So,
Yeah.
for instance, things like the modulicious documentation is very
It's very
interesting
good.
often,
And yeah,
because sometimes you maybe don't know that things even exist. So what I sometimes actually do, even though I just stated the opposite, but actually it's not true. Sometimes I really look there and see what's actually there. If I see something interesting, I just follow what's there. It is also helpful. Yeah, and when I started, it was helpful to have Kulo, who often told me things. But I think at this point, more is available in our documentation, and we don't rely so much on people telling you things like setting up Postgres
okay,
and so on.
that's good. Cool. Thank you. So with that, let's take that as the final words. Thank you, Marius,
Okay.
very much for sharing how your usual day looks like. Could you quickly go to that first tab in the browser and go to the workshop topics list, because then we will see what we have planned for the next week. So we have covered now how the development team, the QE Tools works. Scroll down a bit. That's
Yes.
and the next one after the longer holiday break on the 20th of January will be that we will talk about how my work as the product owner within the SUSE team works. Likely a bit shorter because lots of how I work you might already know from other sessions like roadmap presentations. But thank you all for attendance, and then hope to see you again next time.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you for attendance. If you have further questions, just ask me in the chat. Or of course I can stay here a little bit longer.
Yep, we'll do that.